Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Publisher Growth Strategies in the Era of Fake News. We're really excited to have everybody here today, and thanks everyone for joining. So today's webinar is hosted by myself. I'm Dan, I'm a product marketing manager. I'm on the far right. And also my colleague, Ethan Chernofsky, who's the Director of Corporate Marketing.
Hey guys, how are you?
And then we're also really excited to have Sara Fischer. She's a media reporter from Axios Media, and she'll be joining us today.
Hey everyone.
And so we're really excited to have everyone, and it's going to be a great session. So let's go ahead and get started. So today's session is broken down into 4 different parts. We're going to start with a brief introduction to Similarweb, and then we'll move on to looking at Axios Media, which has been a really incredible success story from a digital perspective, and kind of look behind the scenes at some of those strategies that's driven their digital success. And then next we'll move into more of a broader review of the media landscape and how some of the brands are able to succeed in an era of growing fake news outlets. And then lastly, we will have a Q&A. So feel free to ask questions throughout this webinar, and we'll be able to answer them at the end. And to ask questions, you'll just want to check on your GoToWebinar panel. There's a section called Questions, and just feel free to enter your questions there. So I wanted to start by just kind of talking a little bit about Similarweb. Similarweb is a market intelligence platform, and we provide insights basically on every website, every app, and every geography of the world. And we do this, it sort of sounds like magic, but the way that we actually do it is through a very complex process of collecting and processing data. And so data really is the foundation of our business, and we take a pretty unique approach to how we collect our data. And so here on the screen you can see we have 4 main sources that we collect our data from. We have the global panel data, which we have a dedicated product team that's responsible for building and partnering with hundreds of consumer products that make up our panel. So our panel is actually comprised of hundreds of millions of devices, both mobile and desktop. And these devices cover the entire world. We also partner with ISP partners, so this provides us with supplemental data sources. So we also have these partnerships with global ISPs, and this data is really tied together with public data sources. So we're able to kind of sort and process all this data using information that's available publicly on the world and on the web, and we're able to then categorize the web and kind of understand the relationship between websites. And lastly, this is all really tied in with direct measurement data. So we're lucky enough to have hundreds of thousands of directly measured accounts that have connected their data with Similarweb. And so we're able to kind of run this entire process through our calibration and estimation and algorithms to kind of extrapolate this data and understand the digital world and digital consumption. Taking a look at a few of our customers in the space, we really work across lots of different industries, and you can see quite a few different types of media companies here, just to get a sense of who are some of our partners for Similarweb. And that's it for the brief intro. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to my colleague Ethan, who's going to talk a little bit about Axios and the success that they've had on their digital strategy.
Hey everybody, so before we kind of dive into Axios specifically, I think it would be a good time to talk about 3 themes that we are going to be looking at throughout the course of this webinar. So the first is the idea of brand versus social. So essentially, how important it is where your traffic is coming from, and what are the primary sources that are driving growing, strong publishing brands. The second piece is the reign of content continuing. So we all know that content is king, and we are going to take a deep look at whether the king is still going to be reigning for long. And finally, we're going to look at something that we're calling the social red flag. And so with that as our background, let's dive in. So beyond the joy of being able to host Sara, who's one of the leading voices covering the media industry, Axios itself is a really amazing example of what it takes to grow during this media environment. So if you take a look at December 2016, you would notice that Axios has literally zero traffic. Now, that is not because of any issue with the way they were doing their journalism or reporting. It was actually because the site was yet to launch. And so we wanted to compare them against 3 other giants in the space. So this is Fortune, TechCrunch, and International Business Times, to take a look at how other people were performing in the same period. So you can see that the 3 of them have a very huge lead over Axios, which is only going to launch a month later in January 2017. Now, moving forward, what's interesting is that when you look later on, that Axios has made up a tremendous amount of ground, and not just a tremendous amount of ground from going from 0 to 62 million visits over that period, but actually catching up to some of the leading publishers in the space and showing really amazing traction along the way. Now, the real question, though, isn't just about where they started and where they ended, but it's how they got there. So I think this is a great chance for us to ask Sarah, what do you think it is that sets Axios apart from a publishing perspective?
Thank you so much for having me, and it's a great question. I think one of the things that we have focused on is hiring issue area experts, people who have been following a topic for a very long time, so that when it does come time for us to report on it, we get a lot of scoops, a lot of things that are original to the platform, so that you have to click Axios if you want to get that news or information. I think the other thing too is that we focus a lot of design and technology to create a really seamless user experience that will get people to want to engage in the platform over and over. We noticed with some of our competitors that when you get to their website, there could be hundreds of links on a homepage. It's very overwhelming for the user, particularly on mobile. And so users tend not to go directly to that web platform, but rather go in through a side door, through a link that they click on social media. Axios platform does not have a homepage. It has one simple scrolling feed. And so it's very friendly to a user that's used to navigating the web on their mobile phone that way on platforms like Facebook or Twitter. So I'd say the long answer to your short question is it's a combination of ensuring that we have original breaking content on the website that comes from experts who are reputable, as well as having a seamless user experience that we can attribute to a really sophisticated design backed by technology.
Sounds like an incredible answer, and I think that with the next slide you're going to see is what that turns into as a result. So you're looking at a site that at the same time, while they have not yet reached the full level of some of the larger competitors who've been around for decades, you're seeing tremendous response in terms of engagement metrics. Now, 4.6 pages per visit is not just good, it's exceptional in the space, and it's actually more than double, almost double what you're seeing from the next closest competitor in that area. A bounce rate of under 50% is, again, exceptional. And what it's showing is people are coming to receive the content that they're looking for, and then they're staying along. So the experience is seamless, it's giving them what they're looking for, and they're willing to stay on the page for quite a long time. And I think when you take a level deeper, what you're seeing is something even more important, which is where the traffic is coming from. And we go back to this concept of understanding brand versus social. This is the first place that we get to take a look at it. So if you take a look at Axios, you're seeing that the overwhelming majority of their traffic is actually coming from direct search. Now, direct search means I sign on to my browser, I put Axios into Google, and because I am looking to get to that page specifically, which shows that in a period of just 10 months, the brand has done an exceptional job in getting a large number of its audience and a large number of people to look to them and to develop a relationship with them, expecting great content and coming back for it on a regular basis. The next piece you look at that is a strong referral source. And in the media space, this is really important because what it tells you is that other media sources are quoting them. So if I know that the journalism is exceptional at Axios, when they put out a report on something or when they have breaking news or a scoop, like Sara alluded to, I'm going to refer back to that article because I know it's a trusted source, I know I can rely on it, and I know it's high quality. And what's probably most important is that both of those sources significantly outweigh organic search, paid search, or display ads or the like, as these mechanisms are generally ways to get traffic in, but it's not necessarily the highest quality traffic. And so when you see those sources being emphasized, what you end up finding is that bounce rates are much higher, pages per visit are much lower, time on site is much lower, and the engagement metrics that are so core to developing a real relationship and showing the value of a publisher get lost in the mix. So now that we've looked at Axios specifically, it's a great chance for us to take a look at the wider media landscape, and specifically growth in the era of fake news. So the first slide we have is showing you the overall media landscape from May 2016 to October 2017. And what we see is overall stagnation. Now, there is a certain degree of peak in the lead up to the US election, as that's a major media event. And we see an expected mini decrease following it, yet we're not seeing any major change up. And if we're seeing a period of stagnation, that's something that's going to force us to ask some serious questions. And the first question we'd love to ask Sara is, why do you think we've seen a period where media, at least online consumption, hasn't grown overall?
I think that's a wonderful question, because every media organization is rattling their brains trying to think, how do I obtain more of a person's time and attention when there are only 24 hours in a day? It's a zero-sum game. And I think part of the problem is that we've really reached a point of peak saturation, both from what our web ecosystem can sustain, but also from what a user can sustain and can ingest. From the web ecosystem perspective, you'll take a look at some of the stats coming out of places like eMarketer, and it will show that there has been a really slowed growth in things like digital video and things like Facebook newsfeed, simply because there just isn't enough eyeballs in the world to ensure that more and more can continue to be consumed. From a user perspective, people are spending, according to the latest stats, around 12 hours a day. That's with media, and that includes overlaps, second screens, etc. Because there's so much saturation, it's really hard to increase the overall consumption of media at this point. If you take a look back to when we only had linear TV, thinking back to like the late 80s and early 90s, the growth curve for the amount in which people could consume was so much greater, because we didn't have smartphones, we didn't have media in front of us immediately. Now that most people, I think almost 90% of Americans, have access to smartphones, the growth rate is really saturated, and so it's hard for this chart that you're looking at to really spike tremendously, because quite frankly we've reached a point where we're at our highest point.
So, and this is really important, because when you're talking about a situation where you don't have enough eyeballs, as Sara said, and you have saturation, it becomes a zero-sum game. And so the question for growth is, how do you win over more people to consume your content as opposed to something else? And when we look at this market, we see that 3 of the more traditional publishers are actually seeing tremendous growth. So NewYorkTimes.com saw 28% growth, CNN.com 30% growth, TheWashingtonPost.com a massive period of 40% growth over the last 18 months in a period of relative stagnation. And that means that these outlets are winning in a situation where others are not. And so, Sara, brand recognition seems to be a real key for driving market share changes for these types of outlets. What has been, do you think, the biggest trigger towards making brand as important as it is now in the publishing space?
I think as you see technology become more democratized, almost anyone can create a website, anyone can create a video or post something, it has created a lot of noise. And so emphasis on brand recognition as a media company has become even more paramount, because in order to cut through that noise, people have to have a positive and familiar sense of who you are and what it is that you do. And to increase brand recognition, there are so many things that go into it. It's not just making sure that you're doing everything right online, but offline as well. At Axios, we do so many speaking engagements. We go on TV. We participate in things like this, webinars, to make sure that our brand recognition is constantly evolving and becoming more distinct, so that when viewers do see us online in a really noisy and crowded environment, they're more likely to visit our property knowing who we are.
I mean, that's I think a really important piece of the puzzle is understanding how important it is not just to be available and to be on networks where other people might be going, but to stand out. And the key here is, again, is this brand recognition. And it's not just the classic publishers that we see, but we've seen an equal rise for outlets normally associated with right-wing reporting. So Breitbart, Fox News, Drudge Report. These are all outlets that have seen an equivalent rise. And in this era of fake news, we're seeing people turn to the outlets that they trust, to hearing opinions that they know and agree with from sources that they believe to be true and responsible for delivering accurate news. And Sara, how do you maintain that level of trust with users over time?
I think a large part of it is being a smart assignment editor, knowing what it is that you should and shouldn't cover and what's worthy of our time, of their time rather. Axios actually means worthy in Greek. And so when I look at the landscape of news, part of what gets readers to trust us is me deciding that's worth covering, or that's something valid that should be covered, or that source is trusted versus that source isn't. Making these really tough editorial decisions is a huge part of what helps readers trust us. And they don't always come just from the newsroom. Those editorial decisions actually happen at every level and every department. Our business side has to make sure that when they accept ads, there's 100% transparency in who's paying for them and what their communication goals are. Our social team has to be transparent in the way that they frame clips on Facebook versus the way that they would headline something on Twitter. And last but not least, our booking and PR teams have to be really transparent about what our mission is, about who are our backers, and about what we're aiming to do. And if across the entire organization we can remain transparent, then our users can ensure that the content we're putting out in front of them is honest. If we don't have transparency at every level, from the newsroom and beyond, it makes it harder for readers to trust us.
And I think you see the result when you see how outlets that have that trust are growing at the expense of sites who haven't necessarily built up the same level of credibility. And so what you see here is, from that same period, the change in traffic share between the New York Times and CNN on one side, and BuzzFeed and Pop Sugar, two of the larger viral outlets, on the other. So we're seeing reductions of nearly 40% for Pop Sugar, of 25% for BuzzFeed, while on the flip side, periods of 28% and 30% growth respectively for the New York Times and CNN. And this change is something that we can also see going back to that same element of where is the traffic coming from. And when you look at this graph, the first thing that stands out is how dependent BuzzFeed, one of the largest publishers in the world, is on social traffic. And why do you think, Sara, that we're seeing social media dependent channels seeing such massive reductions?
I think it depends channel to channel and what other offerings they bring to the market. BuzzFeed's a great example versus Huffington Post because they've invested so much in hard news coverage. Even in Washington, D.C. alone, they've increased their regulatory and legislative reporters like tenfold. And so while they do really rely on social traffic, I think they have a very diversified strategy that will ensure that they won't just rely on social forever for clicks. They're trying to build up a brand, a trusted news source brand so that when Facebook changes its algorithm or Google changes the way that it ranks its search feed, they will have developed audience loyalty through their hard news reporting. If I take a look at something like Huffington Post, they're really interesting to me because they rely a lot on search and social traffic, of course, but they haven't invested, I wouldn't say to the same extent lately as BuzzFeed has in increasing its hard news reporting. And so they're someone that I keep an eye on when I look at stats like this of that correlation between really developing an audience relationship through original reporting and content versus aggregated social news.
It's very, very interesting to see how those data sources work together and so often are correlated. And I think what we see is that there is this overall trend of social visits as a primary source going down. So if overall social visits as a lead source are in decline, then those sites that become dependent on it are in a certain degree in a place of less certainty and less strength. So what can a publisher do to improve their reach in an environment where just a few years ago social was seen as the key to growth?
I think trying to understand how you increase side door traffic, so traffic that comes to your site that's not direct but isn't social either. So one of the ways you do that is, as you had mentioned prior to this piece, is focus on getting links to your site from other web properties that will cite you. And that includes having original content or breaking news. Or maybe you go off platform and you start to take a look at new distributors of web traffic. Those distributors might not be social media platforms, but they could be platforms like Apple News, news distribution or platforms that will help drive engagement. At Axios, one of the great drivers of engagement for us has been Flipboard. It's not a social media company. It's a company that's designed to distribute traffic to just hard news sources. These are things that we're focusing on as a publisher. How do we get traffic not just directly, but from side doors that aren't social media?
It's so important, and I think what we're hearing so much about Axios is that it's this dual focus. It's how do we make sure that we're bringing the right people in an environment that's changing, but at the same time, how do we make sure that once they arrive, they're getting this exceptional experience that's going to keep them coming back on their own accord? And when we look at the next slide, it's actually the big sign of hope for outlets like BuzzFeed is what we're seeing here, which is that while traffic might be in decline, there are engagement metrics that are truly off the charts. So a bounce rate of 33% means that 2/3 of people that are coming to visit the site are consuming multiple pages. Again, this isn't just a good metric, it's truly exceptional, and their pages per visit are also incredibly high, showing that they truly understand that content is king, and that if you give someone a great experience, they're going to consume a lot of content and they're going to keep on coming back. The question then becomes, how do you adapt the strategy of getting people to reach you when social channels are showing a certain degree of weakness? And it could be via these side doors like Sara was discussing, or it could be through other channels. But understanding that at the center, if you're able to maintain a really strong content experience, you're going to give yourself a very strong chance. But what's really interesting is when we measure BuzzFeed comparison, more apples to apples. So as Sara mentioned, they certainly have an exceptionally strong newsroom that has been invested in quite a bit. But it's also very interesting to see what they do compared to more traditional viral sites who don't necessarily have the same news component. So when you compare them, you see that their bounce rate is still exceptional, their pages per visit are exceptional, and that's leading to monthly traffic and unique visitors that are much higher than the norm of what others are seeing. And what's really important there is when you look at this graph that they're maintaining a really strong lead, which asks a really important question of what is the key to the future of these viral sites?
I think the key to the future of these viral sites is diversifying your content distribution strategy, but also your content strategy. One of the things I mentioned again with BuzzFeed is they're really investing in breaking news, in hard news, investigative, and original reporting. In fact, if you take a look at the majority of the sites reporting on Russia meddling, fake news, and disinformation on the web, almost all of it is exclusive or original reports that have been picked up and everywhere on the internet. In fact, at Axios, we rely really heavily on BuzzFeed's coverage of these really new, nuanced topics to drive our coverage. I don't see that same level of investment in reporting or investment in new original content at some of these other sites. Now, granted, they're not all attempting to be breaking news sites, but there are ways that you can create original content without breaking news. It could be a really original video, something we've never seen before, or an interview with someone who isn't typically on the record. This type of thirst for original content is so important. Users are crowded with so much information on the web that they always want to be informed or presented with something new. And I think that's what BuzzFeed has done better than some of its competitors.
And how do you think that the fake news era has impacted news sites and consumption patterns?
I think it's made readers a little bit more skeptical of the stuff that they're getting on social media, which might be why, by the way, you're not seeing as much traffic come from social anymore, because people are less likely to click things that they think are going to be fake or going to be a scam. The other way I think fake news affects news consumption and publishers is that it really has created more of an impetus for publishers to sort of make their news or their content stand out. And in doing that, you sometimes see some publishers cater to a lower common denominator, really hyperbolic headlines or really just sort of overblown content so that they can keep up with the virality of fake news. This is the bad sign, the bad effect of fake news, when some publishers try to sort of succumb to the sensationalist aspect of it. But the good side of it, as I mentioned before, is that other publishers are taking it as a way to really hone in on their brand, hone in on good content. And those are typically, by the way, the publishers that are thriving in the subscription environment. They're actually creating such sound news and information that people now say they want to pay for it.
What do you think that we'll see in the subscription environment? Do you think it's poised to rise? Do you think that the reduction in some of these viral sites is actually going to create a cleaner landscape where more people are going to be going to the site, so they'll be able to monetize off of advertising more effectively? Where do you see the future of the subscription side?
It's interesting. Big national papers are doing incredibly well with subscriptions. I'm talking about the New York Times and the Washington Post, but smaller local papers aren't. People are making the decision that if they are going to spend money on news, they want to spend it with an outlet that has the resources to give them a huge breadth of information and often high-level information. If you think about the New York Times, if you get that full subscription suite, not only are you getting all of their breaking news reporting, you're getting their cooking section. You're getting access to some of their new standalone apps, maybe their crossword app. Whereas the local newspapers, people aren't paying as much for subscriptions. And so the future of subscriptions looks really bright for traditional publishers who have developed mass national audiences and have a large array of products to offer with that money. It doesn't look as great for some of the smaller publishers. Now, you ask me, what does the future look like, especially in an era where advertising is declining? Advertising digitally overall is growing, but advertising revenue for publishers is shrinking because Google and Facebook are overwhelmingly dominant in that area. So I think the future of subscriptions is that publishers are now thinking about them much more seriously as a revenue growth opportunity because they have to. They can no longer rely on digital advertising because There's just not enough to go around for publishers in this space. In fact, most new studies will say that Facebook and Google are poised to take around 85% of every new ad dollar in the US this year.
And with that, it's actually a really nice transition into what does this mean for brands? And I'm going to turn it back over to Dan for this.
Awesome, thanks. And so, as we see on this slide, when we analyze a major advertiser like Axios, we see that BuzzFeed, who we were just discussing before, actually does an excellent job at monetizing their traffic. And so when a site is able to drive lots of traffic like we saw before, but especially engaged traffic like we saw in those previous slides, they're actually able to drive lots of ad revenue. So looking at who are the publishers that are driving traffic to Axios, you see that BuzzFeed is by far the largest publisher. So it's quite interesting to kind of understand how effective some of these sites that have engaged content can be at driving traffic to advertisers.
Yeah.
Another example here, kind of showing the same story, is looking at Target. So Target analyzing another major advertiser. BuzzFeed again is at the top of the list, and so driving more display traffic than other players like even ABC News or ESPN, Huffington Post. So users are actually coming to BuzzFeed. They're staying engaged, but not only are they engaged and view lots of content, but what I really like about this is it's showing that these users are so happy that they're even able to and willing to continue their user journey to a site like Target and potentially consider purchasing something. So it's really tells a nice story, I think, about the overall consumer journey and how willing BuzzFeed users are to go to big advertiser sites to do the shopping. And I wanted to kind of take a look at some of the ways that these advertisers are also kind of able to drive traffic to their specific sites, and that's through looking at and understanding their content and creative process. So here we can just see a small sample of hundreds of different creative assets and landing pages across desktop and mobile, banner and video, but it's really important to kind of consider the types of ad creative and the story and brand that these advertisers are trying to tell, and so we're able to kind of understand an entire advertiser strategy from their creative, from their assets, from their landing pages, and really trying to understand what they're trying to tell, the story they're trying to tell through these publishers like BuzzFeed. And looking on the reverse side, actually at the publishers, looking at BuzzFeed, what we see is quite interesting, and it's that BuzzFeed places a major emphasis on developing partnerships with brands that focus on online sales. So the big takeaway here is being strong, being engaged from a business perspective. It's sending them to the right places. They're able to monetize this traffic, and a lot of this traffic is going to shopping sites. And so I think that's a really interesting story that we're able to see from the sort of the publisher-advertiser relationship. And just to kind of the last site I wanted to look at and kind of compare, juxtapose to BuzzFeed's strategy in media sales is looking at CNN and where they're actually monetizing their display traffic. Who are the advertisers that are spending money with them? And when we analyze CNN, we actually see that it's a really wide variety of different types of traffic. And we're going out on a limb here, but let's say that explore parts unknown and definition.org are probably not as lucrative partnerships as, let's say, some of the top global retailers like Target that we saw before ASOS. So I think it's pretty interesting to kind of compare the different audiences and all the different advertisers that are working with these different partners and what that says about the users and their engagement. So thank you everybody for coming to this webinar. We got a lot of questions throughout, and we wanted to just wrap up the session with a few questions that we got. So let's see. We'll start with the first question we got from James, which is, who do you think are the best publishers which of the publishers are doing the best job? So maybe I'll let Ethan take that, and then Sarah, we'd love to hear from you as well on that.
So I think the key is to look at both of those sides of the spectrum. So there is the one piece that is how are people growing brands, and I think at the New York Times of the world, the CNNs of the world, the Axioses of the world are doing an exceptional job of creating an experience that develops a relationship with those who are consuming media. But I think on the flip side, I would be really bullish on a BuzzFeed's future. Their capacity to create an incredibly compelling experience for a user is really exceptional, and you see what the business impact of that is. And as Sarah mentioned, their commitment to good, strong news coverage and long-form news, which was seen as a thing of the past for a long time, I think there's a lot of reasons to believe in them as a really strong player moving forward. Sarah, I'd love to hear who you were kind of looking at.
Totally agree. I am so bullish about BuzzFeed. This commitment to original reporting and content that can be linked and other news outlets, creating a new avenue for traffic, as well as a commitment to staying active on social and creating for social audiences, has given BuzzFeed a really dynamic, strong, and flexible strategy for ensuring that a really healthy mix of traffic comes into the site. I also think the other publishers that I have in mind that I think are doing a really good job are Quartz, which is owned by The Atlantic. They're a little bit more of a serious hard news publisher, but they've done some really interesting things with technology that I think have driven traffic to their mobile properties in a way that's compelling. At Axios, we try to always take a look at some of the publishers, the big national publishers, and what they're doing. And of those big national publishers, I think we've seen a lot of interesting things coming out of the Washington Post. They've been able to drive a ton of traffic in similar ways that BuzzFeed has, but at the same time, they've also been able to distribute it through their technology properties and products in a way that I think is a little bit more advanced than some of the other national papers out there.
Awesome. So the second question we got here is from Anna. How much do you consider social channels when you're creating content?
Sarah, maybe you should take this one as the journalist in the room.
I create content based off of its news value and its news value only. However, what our social team will reimagine that content for social media. And I think that's the right way to do it. I think if you have a news website, I can't speak on behalf of people who have, commerce or entertainment or lifestyle websites. But if you have a news website, the number one thing that you need to do in order to increase brand loyalty and user trust is only create content that is based off of the editorial merit. Then, if you need to change the way that you present that content, maybe a brighter picture or a different headline for social media or different social media platforms, you can do that. But for me, it's definitely something that I, as a journalist, think about after the fact. Our social publishing team, however, they just think about it in such a different way. Every time I write an article, they will remake that article for Twitter with a new headline and a new image. And then for Facebook, same thing. And even sometimes for Snapchat or Apple News.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense of taking that strategy. So third question is from Pascal. What do you think is the value of video-based strategies? Is it better to go viral? Sarah, I know you have a few opinions on video-based strategies, so I'd really love to hear your opinion on that.
Yeah, I think one of the problems that we're seeing, especially here in the United States, is that video is really being pushed by business demands as opposed to consumer demand. Consumers are actually happy much of the time with text. They do like consuming video on social media, but they also like really short, to the point text to get their news. We've seen this historically when people have signed up for RSS feeds or, even short mailers. But this is the first time that we really have had to stop and think, are we creating video for the sake of pre-roll, which is really lucrative, or creating it because our users want it? And I think most publishers will tell you that there needs to be a balance. At Axios, we actually don't create much editorial video because our monetization strategy is very different. But for publishers that are reliant on scale and they want to ensure that they can charge a high premium for pre-roll when their scaled banner ads are becoming less and less lucrative, there's a demand to create that editorial video to give pre-roll a room to run. My advice to people when it comes to creating video is to think about what is your return on investment. If it's going to cost you a certain amount of money to create a video that won't necessarily go viral and you're not going to be able to sell a lot of pre-roll against it, you might really have to think about, do I have to tell this story through a video or could I tell it through text? That's something that every publisher should consider before they go into video or creating video for a story.
Great. Thank you very much, Sarah. And so we have a quick question from Cindy, who asked if this webinar is being recorded and will be shared. Yes, we are recording the webinar, and we will send out a recording after we finish up. The next question is from Deb, and it's a question about Similarweb. Is Similarweb able to show me impressions? Yeah, so great question. It's actually something that we're really excited to finally be getting into. It's sort of been a request for quite a long time, and I think we're really in a special place because we're not able to just show traffic like we've shown before from publishers to advertisers, but we're actually able to show impressions now as well. And so Similarweb is currently showing impressions by creative, and we're going to be introducing this into more sections of the platform. But I think it's a really unique way to kind of not only understand, like Sarah mentioned before, the number of eyeballs that are seeing an advertisement, but how effective they are by looking at how much traffic publishers are driving to advertisers. And the last question, and for anyone we didn't get a chance to answer your question, we'll definitely be able to follow up on a one-on-one basis and take you through in depth as well. So the last question for today is from Tim. Do you think these trends will continue in a more stable media environment? So Sarah, I think we'd love to hear your opinion, and maybe Ethan just to wrap things up as well after.
I don't think we'll ever get to a point where we have a more stable media environment. I think we are on the cutting edge, but the beginning edge of technological advancements that will continue to shape the landscape. And so part of the chaos around, traffic and engagement and monetization is a direct result of the fact that we haven't had a steady media environment since the introduction of the smartphone. If you think about it historically, print newspapers, hundreds of years old, were interrupted by radio, and the advertising market took a little while to follow suit because of some of the business complications, especially regulatory complications that impacted business. Then came along broadcast, and broadcast was, for the most part, one type of spectrum wave until it was disrupted by cable a couple decades later. And then, just a short while later, digital came through. And the economics between TV, newspapers, and their digital sites completely threw off everything that publishers had known and become familiar with. The introduction of the smartphone has expedited these changes in a way that we can't even begin to understand. The biggest driver of change has been we went from, in most of these mediums, having fixed inventory. If you think about it, if you're a cable or broadcast network, you only had 24 hours a day of programming to sell ads against. And if you were a newspaper, you only had 30, 40 pages of content to sell ads against. Now demand is infinite, and so we are at a place where with infinite demand there's always going to be infinite room to serve it to you. And so I don't imagine we'll ever get to a place where we are at a steady, consistent media environment for a very long time, if ever.
It's very interesting because I think Sarah went on the technology side of that question. I'm going to come at it from more of the social environment that we're operating within, specifically that kind of fake news era. And so I think a lot of this is going to be cyclical. We're going to have periods of greater stability, and that's going to allow softer content to thrive, and I think we're going to have periods of greater uncertainty, and that's going to push us towards brands that we trust and know and go back to in kind of these traditional publishers. And I think from a brand perspective, it means understanding how these cycles are happening and where you should be, how you should be adjusting your strategies accordingly. And I think from the publisher perspective, it goes back to, you know, what Sara spoke about much earlier, which is diversification. You know, she spoke about, you know, the New York Times having a great cooking section or travel section. And I think if you're a viral site, following in the steps of a BuzzFeed and saying, how do we do news more effectively? And if you're on the traditional side, saying, how do we create content that's going to be more fun and engaging that fits within a wider picture? So I think it all comes back to the strategies that you're able to deploy once you understand what the setting is.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys very much. It's been a really, really interesting conversation. We were really fortunate to have Sara Fischer with us, and I sure learned a lot. And Sara comes with really, really interesting thought leadership and a really great background as well. So she's seen a lot of these changes take place in the industry. And thank you very much as well, Ethan. It's been really fun hosting this webinar. So thank you everybody for joining. We will share the recording of this webinar. For any other questions, feel free to reach out to sales@similarweb.com. And we look forward to seeing you on the next webinar. All right, everybody, take care.